Ready? Hey, well, welcome to another episode of 10 with Tom. My name is Tom, and this is where we get to explore faith 10 minutes at a time. Today, I want to talk about the power of asking good questions. In the Gospels, Jesus is asked 187 questions. He answered maybe 8 of them. 187 questions, but he only answered 8. He himself asks 307 questions. I mean, think about that. Maybe faith isn't about certainty, but learning to ask and sit in the complexity of good questions. We're in this series at church on Sunday called Proverbalife, and really it's just kind of a look at the book of Proverbs, which is really a book about wisdom. And what I love about Proverbs is that the stuff in Proverbs, the little kind of proverbs, the little axioms of truth, of wisdom, they really work. I mean, even if you're not a Christian, it's just really good advice for the most part. And one of the big ideas of this series, Proverbalife, and we kind of stole this from Andy Stanley's book, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, is this often overlooked relationship between good questions and good decisions. Good questions and good decisions. And the reality is that good questions actually set us up to make good decisions. In some ways, our decisions are no better than the questions that we ask or the questions we don't know to ask. Lloyd Alexander, a famous philosopher, he said this: in some cases we learn more by looking for the answer to a question and not finding it than we do from learning the answer itself. And I found that to be absolutely true in my own spiritual journey. And I'm absolutely convinced that if we as followers of Christ would get into the habit of asking, answering honestly, and then acting on those good questions, I think we'll make better decisions, which will consequently leave us with fewer regrets. Now, one of my favorite paintings of all time, and I've spoken about that. I don't think I've spoken about it on 10 with Tom, but I know I've preached around this, and there's actually, I have it tattooed on my arm. People always ask me, what's my, show us, okay. I have a large tattoo on my arm, and it's actually a painting, it's a copy of a painting by a guy named Caravaggio. In the 18th century, he painted a painting called The Incredulity of St. Thomas. And I want to put it on the screens, and I want you just kind of to stare at this painting because there's so much here, and it's such a beautiful painting. And the context of the story is Thomas, doubting Thomas, as he's been come to know. He basically, Jesus appears to his disciples after the resurrection, but Thomas isn't there. And when Thomas returns and the disciples say, we saw the resurrected Christ, he says, no ways, I don't believe it. Unless I see him with my own 2 eyes, unless I stick my fingers in his side, in the places where he was pierced, in the holes in his hands, then I won't believe it. And as he says that, Jesus appears. It's almost like, I think Jesus was just having a bit of fun, like, boo, I'm here. And then there's this moment, and this is what's depicted in the painting. There's this moment where we see Thomas stick his finger into Jesus' side, as recorded in the Gospels. And the painting is so well done. It uses a technique called chiaroscuro, which is like this very harsh lighting. And you can see Jesus is kind of in the light, and the disciples are coming out of the darkness into the light. But what I love about the painting, if you look closer, is that it's almost as if Jesus is pulling Thomas's hand into his side. And what that says, what people have kind of remarked about it, what it says to me is that Jesus was not afraid of Thomas's doubts. And he wasn't afraid of Thomas's questions. You know, so often we build faith, which I say it's like a brick wall faith, that if you take one brick out, the whole wall comes crumbling down. And I think that's a very immature faith. And I think so many people have lost their faith because the faith they had in the first place was kind of very rigid, very black and white, in or out. And so when they get out there into the real world and realize that things aren't so straightforward, then they kind of question everything and their whole faith crumbles. And I don't think it has to be that way. In fact, if Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, which I believe he is, then the reality is any honest and sincere pursuit of truth, whether that's through science, whether that's through philosophy, whatever it is, will ultimately lead us to him. Yeah. So we don't have to be afraid of our questions. We don't have to be afraid of our doubt. We don't have to tell people, stop asking such difficult questions, just believe, just have faith. No, yes, there is always an element of faith, but faith, the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is actually certainty. Because if we have certainty, then we don't need faith. And so the invitation of this painting, the invitation of Jesus, the invitation to Thomas, and I believe to all of us, is to poke, to actually stick your fingers in that, to ask the difficult questions. Yeah. You see, for Thomas, this moment led him to say in John 20, verse 28, "My Lord and my God." You see, when Thomas actually saw Jesus, touched Jesus, realized he wasn't a ghost, that he was actually flesh and blood, resurrected, he believed. He says, "This is my Lord and my Messiah." And his entire life was changed. Thomas became Saint Thomas. And he went on to be a missionary, mostly in what is now India, telling people about the resurrected Jesus. So questions are sacred. Questions lead to worship. And so what I want to ask you, the question I want to ask you today is, what questions do you have? What doubts are you wrestling with? What questions are maybe you're afraid to ask? Or maybe you've been avoiding? As Andy Stanley says, is there a tension that deserves your attention? Well, pay attention to that tension. Don't ignore it. Don't brush by it. Don't try and justify it or paint over it with kind of the veneer of, I've just got to have faith, or I'll never understand. No, ask. Dive deep. Do the research. Ask people. Speak. Do an Alpha course. Whatever it is. Let me say it again. In the Gospels, Jesus is asked 187 questions. He answers maybe 8 of them. And he himself asks 307. Because he's drawing people to a real and authentic faith that they could own, that wasn't handed to them, but actually became part of them. And I know we want certainty. It's nice to have simple black and white answers. And I think even more so now, because we live in a world that's full of uncertainty. So we're craving certainty. But maybe faith isn't about certainty. Maybe it's about, as I said, learning to ask and sit in the complexity of good questions. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode of 10 with Tom. Wow. Let me try that again. Swallowed a spitball there. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode of 10 with Tom. Like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you next time.